to a brand new program that the Ayn Rand Center UK has just initiated. We're going to be starting a weekly discussion of Leonard Peikoff's speeches and essays. And today we're starting with one of his best and most important, Why Should One Act on Principle? A Ford Hall forum he gave back in 1988. We hope to continue this every weekend. It'll probably in the future be on Sundays as opposed to today. Is that correct, Razi? It'll be on Sundays as opposed to today. No. Excuse me, that's for the seminars tomorrow, the workshops tomorrow. The Peikoff speeches will be, though, and essays will be handled here on Fridays. Please forgive me for my mistake there. I was confusing it with another program, but we have a whole new program here just focused on Leonard Peikoff speeches and essays that we'll be doing on Fridays. Forgive me, Fridays. And today, as I say, we're doing one of Dr. Peikoff's most important essays, Why Should One Act on Principle? Originally delivered in 1988 at Boston's Ford Hall Forum. The speech is a refutation of pragmatism. And just a little background, Dr. Peikoff was himself a student of pragmatists when he got his PhD at New York University. His dissertation advisor was no less than the famous Professor Sidney Hook, a student of John Dewey himself, and so regarded as one of the leading pragmatist thinkers of his time. So Leonard Peikoff has a personal background here on pragmatism. But more than that, pragmatism is an anti-principled approach. The approach that is skeptical about principles. And we find its forms coming up in many different ways. I have been told when explaining various principles, Leonard Peikoff here starts with the principle of free trade, and it's a really classic one. If you say something like, well, all tariffs must in the long run, you give a classic economic argument, which is basically agreed to by all sensible economists of whatever field, but we're still told by politicians, we're still told by philosophers, we're still told by people on the street, well, that's simplistic. That's simplistic. Now, if you think about the word simplistic for a second, it's really more than just saying something is oversimplified. Oversimplified is a valid objection if someone is making a broad generalization. Because if I've left out an important fact, if I've left out an important relevant factor, then what I've done is I've reduced it to something that's too simple and doesn't account for everything. But when someone says to you, you're being simplistic, simply because you've stated a general abstraction, then what they're doing really is attacking the idea that principles are even possible. It's as if saying, well, that's just too simple, and therefore, as such, it must be invalid. Well, of course, how else does one deal with the complexity of any given issue, such as free trade? Well, a pragmatist will say, the anti-principled approach will say, they'll break it down. Well, free trade what? Free trade with Japan, free trade with autos, free trade with Toyotas, and for how long? Is it going to be 6 months, 6 years? How long will this last? I mean, you can't really answer these questions, according to the pragmatist or your typical politician, with this oversimplified principle of free trade. And so what it turns out to be is an assault on any sort of principle that can cover things abstractly. It is a form of complexity worship, is what it really is. No doubt about it. And you can see this sort of thing come up in a million ways. I mean, just the other day, someone was telling me, oh, what sweeping generalizations. Well, you paint in broad strokes, as I was often told by my college professors. You paint in broad strokes, Mr. Valliant. And those aren't necessarily anti-concepts. Leonard Peikoff describes simplistic as an anti-concept. And by anti-concept, Ayn Rand meant a useless concept, a concept that really has no referent in reality. It's a unnecessary concept. Therefore, an invalid concept without reference. And so it's a concept that is typically used to substitute in for a valid concept. And here you can see oversimplified is a valid complaint. If someone accuses me of oversimplification, even if they do it in using a non-anti concept like broad strokes or sweeping generalizations, still the response is effectively the same. What have I left out? Complexity is a quantitative matter. That means there's a lot of relevant factors. There's a lot of things to take into account. There's a lot of facts that have to be brought to bear. And so if someone accuses you, perhaps validly, of being oversimplified, the question, of course, becomes, what have I left out? But of course, this mentality isn't about that. They are skeptical of principles as such, trained by Kant that concepts are really do not refer to reality, trained by Hume that cause and effect really doesn't exist. It's just an accident that the sun should rise every morning. Trained by Hume, especially in the field of ethics, that you can't derive an ought from an is. They are skeptical of principles as such, and in any field, which is, of course, against the entire human method of thought. The entire human method of thought, which is primarily a conceptual method. Sure, we share perception with the animals, but we can process our perceptual data. In fact, we have to process our perceptual data into concepts and into generalizations. A principle is a generalization. And we can see this in a million ways. For example, if I were to develop the principles, as Peikoff uses here in his example, the principles of correct public speaking or effective public speaking, it wouldn't be very controversial if I were to say, well, motivate your audience, speak and enunciate clearly, give examples they can relate to. All those are perfectly good advice and good principles that would apply to anyone who is a public speaker. And when it comes to practical things like that, people are principled, have no problem employing principles, and in fact realize that they have to employ principles. In areas like physics, Newton called his great theory the Principia, the principles. And what he did was reduce physical motion, the swinging of baseballs on Earth and the orbit of planets around the sun, to a simple set of rules, generalizations that govern everything. So when it comes to something like force equals mass times acceleration, even your Kantian might have a problem with that. Even your Humean might have a problem with that. But your ordinary guy in the street obviously realizes that human beings think in principles because he or she thinks in principles every day. Every day. The principles of driving safely. The principles, there's 100 different categories in which we use principles. It is particularly in the area of ethics. In the area of ethics. And why? Because religion has had the monopoly on pretty much on serious ethical thinking until quite recently, until Ayn Rand, to be specific. Attempts at secular ethics have really been forms of skepticism, forms of an anti-principled approach. And pragmatism is the leading culprit here. The pragmatist, when he approaches an issue, must, for example, let's go back to the free trade issue. Because he is skeptical of broad principles, because he is skeptical of principles as such, his focus to solve any problem, as we said, is to narrow his focus. Well, do you mean free trade with everything? Do you mean free trade just with Japan? Do you mean free trade just with cars? What kind of cars do you mean? And how long will these last? Now you don't have something that's oversimplified. Now you have something that we can actually deal with. And of course, in dealing with it, we have to be flexible. We have to experiment. We can't really be governed by any hangover principle that we might think applies here. So their focus is necessarily to narrow the issue down as much as possible. This, of course, makes the question unanswerable, simply unanswerable. If you cannot connect the dots between free trade with cars and free trade with steel, if you can't connect the dots between free trade with Japan and free trade with Great Britain, then obviously you don't have the correct principle. More than that, you're still going to be operating by principle implicitly. However, what they've done is they've cut out facts to deal with it. They've cut out human knowledge and data in order to cope with the specific question, when, of course, we should be bringing to bear everything we know on the subject of free trade. Free trade in this circumstance, that circumstance. Whatever our principle of free trade happens to be, it has to take into account all of our information, all of the data, all of the history. And that is precisely what the conceptual approach and the principled approach to ideas does. We are inherently conceptual beings. We will be acting on principle implicitly, whether we know it or not. Human beings survive, think, know by means of concepts, and by the concepts we relate to each other in the form of principles, generalized abstractions. It connects to Ayn Rand's unique theory of concepts. For Ayn Rand, concepts are not the meaning of a concept cannot be found in its definition. The meaning of a concept is its content. We do not lose as we form an abstraction. It has generally been thought by previous thinkers that we lose data and that we focus on only the essence. Ayn Rand rejected this approach to concepts in general, and she believed, and she correctly understood concepts as as referring to the objects themselves, the content of the concept itself. When she forms a concept, she doesn't lose any content by focusing on the essence. She actually retains all of the content by focusing on essence. And this, especially as I say, in the area of morality, has been what philosophers have been opposed to. Now, we got to have some questions here. Let's see, we have some, we will be taking ordinary questions, not just super chat questions, just for today. So let me check to see what questions we have here. Oh, we do have some super chat questions. Should one support the Ayn Rand Center UK? Well, that's a really good question. Do you believe in what we're doing? Do you believe in the power of principles and ideas? Do you believe that the most effective thing we can do at this stage in human history is to spread the correct ideas? So it hinges on your view of what is the most effective way to change the future. If you believe in objectivism, let me suggest that I'm not going to say never do politics or never be interested in politics, because we have to. It's a life and death matter. But is politics, daily politics, going to be your focus? Or is philosophical education? Are we going to focus on the ideas that have corrupted us to this point? For example, the idea that principles, ethical principles, are to be regarded skeptically. And that's exactly what Dr. Peikoff is so brilliantly talking about here. No question about it. Thank you very much. Very nice compliment. No, so far we only have some super chat questions and some good compliments to both me and the UK Center Ayn Rand. You know, take the idea all men are mortal. It is a condensation of a vast amount of data that we know about human beings. It is the data, it is the generalization, it is the data which is retained there that allows us to understand that mortality is a factor that human beings have to take into account. And we do all the time. We buy life insurance, we make retirement plans, we prepare for, we find good doctors if we're sick, we make the appropriate adjustments based upon this abstraction that we know about human beings. How can we do that? Because it is a condensation of all that we know that's relevant to a certain aspect of humanity. If we couldn't form generalizations like that, we couldn't act. Unlike animals, we are not able to simply go by our sensations. A dog can go by its smells. A dog can go by its reproductive cycles. The dog has a set of preset repertoire behavior to which it reacts to sense perception. We don't have that. We have no option but to conceptualize the data as best we can and to act on our concepts. That is inevitable. Human beings are conceptual beings, and either we think through our own concepts or we absorb the concepts and principles of those around us unthinkingly. And thus we can get into the position of having strong emotions. Emotions themselves presuppose a moral evaluation of something. So people still get irritated. People still become impressed with heroes. Even pragmatists will do this, but it's a question of feelings that are simply unexamined, not the principles that are behind those, the evaluations, which are necessarily the feelings which inform our emotions. A person who is unprincipled, a person who is a pragmatist and believes in going by the seat of our pants, in effect. We can't be rigidly wedded to old principles. We've got to experiment and be flexible. Those are the hallmarks of this anti-principled approach. To take that kind of approach is, of course, to only increase the problem. As I say, they really can't answer the question. If they can't answer the question anything beyond one narrow little subset, then every time they come up with a new case of that instance, they'll have to rethink it over and over and over. It does not help us solve the problem. It magnifies the problem. Instead of one problem, we now have thousands and thousands of problems because we refuse to organize our data into concepts and principles. Furthermore, a person who is not clear about their principles and anti-principled become unpredictable, truly unpredictable. If a person does not, for example, regard, say, for example, an injunction about honesty or an injunction against theft as a serious principle that they need to take into account, then, of course, you can't know whether they will lie. You can't know whether they will steal. In the case of politicians, it becomes particularly egregious in what happens. Politicians will very often, again, you see, people can't avoid principles, can they? So politicians will often speak in these vague, huge generalities, talk about oversimplified, talk about painting in broad strokes, talk about sweeping generalizations. They will often speak in terms of patriotism, but they'll be so vague that they have absolutely no substance. And gives us no clue as to what the politician might actually do. And in fact, that's the state we're in. Politicians will, by nature, say, oh, well, you can't, again, oversimplify these matters. You can't be simplistic about these matters. You've got to be flexible about these matters, whether it's an anti-concept they use or just an emotionally vague attack on principles that they use. And so it turns out Ronald Reagan will come out, the examples Peikoff uses, Ronald Reagan will come out fiercely against the Iranians and then be caught selling arms to the Contras so that he can shift money over to and help the Iranians. He will be caught in a big fat hypocrisy. Ronald Reagan will come out calling the Soviet Union, this was back in '88 when Reagan was still president, will call the Soviet Union an evil empire. Good for him. But then, of course, he'll talk a few years later about the next arms treaty that he can trust the Soviets to keep. This is and Reagan was compared to most politicians, was relatively principled person. But even he was impossible to predict because he was not an adherent to principles. Only an adherent to principles can have character in that sense, moral character in that sense. We do have some more questions here. Let me see if I can find them. And excuse me if we're using my glasses in here. Recently saw Peikoff that cause and effect is an aspect of identity. A thing acts according to its nature. It is not the billiard ball story we grew up with. Well, in a way it is. No. Causality does not imply that everything acts in a billiard ball way. The billiard ball model of causality is, in fact, only applicable to things like billiard balls. It's action to action in any event. In that sense, it's not even applicable to billiard balls. Because if we're not talking about billiard balls, they won't react that way. A view of causality that is focused on the nature of the thing that acts, and remember, you can't have action out here floating. It's got to be a thing that acts. And it's the thing that acts that determines how it can act and how it will act under certain circumstances. So the billiard ball model of causality is rejected by objectivism. If causality is understood as action to action, you're never going to understand causality, and you'll be very limited to one kind of even scientific methodology. Billiard ball causality, for example, is really unable to explain lots of things in nature. So no, objectivism rejects the billiard ball view of causality, but most definitely has a view of causality. We reject magic. Every action does have a cause, but really, ultimately, in every case, the cause is the nature of the thing that acts. The thing that acts. And that's important here because metaphysically, the grounds for principles, the validity of principles, the validity of induction, metaphysically rests on the law of cause and effect. Without the ability to identify causes, we cannot really complete an act of inductive inference. You know you've completed an act of inductive inference when you've identified the causes. So it's very relevant here. In order to know we have a valid principle, we have to be able to integrate, first of all of the data that's subsumed consistently, and we've got to integrate our principles with one another. If we're able to do that, we're able to find cause and effect, and that's the metaphysical basis for principles being valid. Part of it. Another question. If pragmatism refuses martyrdom, if it is pragmatism to refuse martyrdom, e.g. to use creative accounting, is it pragmatism to refuse martyrdom, to use creative accounting on one's tax return? Does such behavior lead to moral grayness? I would say that it would be wrong to lie under most circumstances. If a thief has got a gun to your head, you have every right to lie about how much money you have in your pocket. In effect, government's got a gun to your head, but it's more complex than that. Government has such a gun to your head that they can put you in prison. They can steal your property if you don't pay their taxes. They can garnish your bank accounts if you don't pay their taxes. Ultimately, they can put you in jail, right? So you'd be creating a martyr of yourself unnecessarily to be a tax cheat, in my view. So as a matter of practicality, not as and it's a moral question. I don't want to be thrown in jail. I want to be free to be productive. So my selfishness really requires me, unfortunately, to be honest with the government, because that could result in something far worse. That does not justify taxes morally. On the other hand, the pragmatist really couldn't have a principle here, could he, about being a martyr or not? Just like the pragmatist, you ask a pragmatist, should I rob a bank? The pragmatist, as Peikoff says, is going to say, well, which bank? Ultimately, of course, that most of them will end up asking, can I get away with it? And that's their bottom line with it. So in that sense, a pragmatist might say, he'll ask the question, should I be a tax cheat, only in the terms of, can I get away with it? If he doesn't want to be a martyr. If he doesn't want to be a martyr. Forgive me, I'm having you in my glasses here and I'm not used to doing this. The inevitability of the death, the inevitability of death is ultimate premise to be questioned. It is only currently technologically inevitable, but capitalism will answer the diseases of aging. I'm not quite I understand the question. Every specific thing in this world is finite. That's the way it is, and so must human life be. Human life will always be a finite thing. Human life, on the other hand, will always be a complex thing. As Dr. Peikoff makes the point here, very importantly, in the ancient world, we're often taught, modern industrial civilization is so much more complex and stressful. Well, no. For the hunter-gatherer, the techniques of hunting, the development of the tools of hunting, the sorting out of which plants are poison and which plants are nutritious is a very complex matter, taking all of his cognitive faculties. Until we start learning these things and these become put under our belt as given knowledge that we can ourselves easily check and that we've learned from our ancestors, does it become so easy, right? In their context, their life was just every bit as complex as ours, in some ways more complex. Technology has simplified our lives in numerous ways. I don't have to spend all the time that human beings used to have to worry about just to get lunch on the table. So I'm trying to connect the question back to the point here. But yeah, life is complex. Life will always be complex. We will always need concepts and principles in order to deal with the vast complexity of facts. The reality is, I hope that answered your question. Super chat. Objectivist principles are very difficult to maintain. So often stand on principles, we yet act on principles. How do you maintain consistency? Well, I don't think that objectivist principles are hard to maintain. There are situations in which obviously there are difficult moral situations, and they're mostly difficult because I have to figure it out. Reality is an absolute. Life and death is an absolute. Maybe that's related to the last question. And it's an absolute we're probably always going to have to deal with. I'm not sure, immortality, infinite life is certainly not going to happen anytime soon. But we have to deal with limits. We have to deal with death. That is one of the reasons why we have to be conceptual, bring all of our relevant knowledge to bear on this. You ask, are objectivist principles hard to practice? Well, they can, certain thing, to be productive, it really depends upon how challenging your productive goals are. The more challenging the goals you set for yourself, the greater will the achievement be in your self-esteem at the end of the day. So there may require hard thinking, it may require hard work, and in some cases it may require some hard judgments that are difficult to make, particularly when judging other people. But objectivist principles are straightforward. Well, you know what really makes this difficult is how people assume religious principles. And this is what gave rise to the plausibility of pragmatism in the first place. Religious principles were never possible to live up to. And it was the impossibility of living up to religious principles that made people burned about moral principles in general. And a pragmatist is almost always a psychologically or psychoepistemologically burned intrinsicist about morality. Since my intrinsic principle, or since my religious principle is unlivable, since altruism is unlivable. See, an altruist cannot be consistent. An altruist depends upon inconsistency. Consistent altruism will result in your death relatively quickly. Christianity is an impossible morality to live up to. Sure, you can go to confession if you're a Catholic and, make up for it, but you can't really be a moral Christian. You can't, a day doesn't pass where you don't lust in your heart if you're a healthy human being. And so you can't be a consistent, Christ's altruism is impossible to live up to. Well, that's the point. Principles now are suspicious. There's no way we can live up to these principles. Therefore, we have to reject moral principles and go by the seat of our pants. Objectivism connects all of its principles to the facts of reality and to human survival. Honesty, if you're dishonest, argues Ayn Rand very powerfully, it's like standing in the way of a truck heading at you at 90 miles an hour. It's suicidal in the long run. And she can demonstrate that. She can demonstrate that you're being irrational and destroying your basic means of survival in the process. This is true for all of her moral principles. This is true for all of her moral principles. They are livable, even when sometimes they may be difficult to live up to. They're still livable. They're based in reality. They're a matter of your actual survival. So no, I believe objectivist principles are easy to live up to, and are the amazing thing about Ayn Rand is she rendered her principles in a totally consistent, integrated way. So that for nearly any ethical question that you can, ask off the top of my head, I can give you a sound answer in principle based on Ayn Rand's ethics. No, it's anything but difficult to maintain. And they are remarkably consistent with both life on Earth, relatively easy to see, if sometimes hard to see in their application. Difficult to enact, I would say, more in their application than see in their application. But certainly we have to think each new application through. But they're not difficult to either understand or to apply to reality because they're based in reality. Why are so many small businesses and creators pragmatists, while so many principled philosophic types shy away from business and risk-taking? That is a very interesting question. Business owners, again, the pragmatism forced, I would say, on business owners is really a result of the impossibility of living in principles. Government regulations often make it very impossible. Government regulation forces them to act against their interest very often. And reality, of course, is telling them they have to act for their interests. And so they're stuck in a conflict. Do I obey the pseudo principles that the government is forcing me to comply with, or the principle of my own profitability and self-interest? So in a world of the mixed economy, we force businessmen into being, just as such, we force businessmen into having to make these impossible choices, which really pit a valid reality-based principle against, some irrational government-created rule. There are businessmen, especially big businessmen, who are a worse category, where they are playing politics, and you can see it today with the woke, politically correct corporations. They fear new regulation. If your great fear, if you're Silicon Valley, for example, I don't deny that Silicon Valley is dominated by leftists, but there are a lot of fields that are dominated by leftists. The fact of the matter is that the government is threatening to sue them and to prosecute them for antitrust and so forth. They're acutely aware of all this. They're acutely aware of all the other complaints against them. And so they kowtow to the government in particular. That too is what goes on. So you ask why a lot of big businessmen are woke, and unprincipled, and acting against their own self-interest and their own business principles sometimes, the principles that would make them profitable. They're afraid of the government gun. When someone points a gun at you, what they're doing is they're demanding that you act against your own best judgment. And that, of course, destroys your capacity to think in principle. Can you address the pragmatic criticism found even among objectivists that we can't wait for a Galt's Gulch in our political structure? Yeah, I can. We have to wait. There is no alternative. It is the ethics of this world, it is the epistemology of this world that is the root of the problem. Until and unless we address those issues, the problem will continue. Why is it that Republicans end us up with just as big a government, in fact, a bigger government when they're done, instead of a smaller one? They end up moving in the socialist direction too. Why? Well, Peikoff directly addresses that in this. Principles, when properly understood, when properly formed, for example, in physics, force equals mass times acceleration. If you ignore the principles of Newton, your rocket is not going to land on a dime on the moon every time as it does. Well, the same is true in ethics. When you have a correct ethical principle, then any violation of it is just as dangerous as violating the rules of physics when you're trying to get to the moon. Principles are absolutes because the facts upon which they are based are absolutes. And if you have properly integrated all the facts, Peikoff's condition for a proper principle, then of course any principle is an absolute. An absolute. Any compromise with a valid principle means that the bad guys win altogether. Any compromise means a total victory for evil. Take the case of the robber comes in. You negotiate with the robber over how much loot he can take. You have conceded the principle of robbery. And now it is simply a question of time as to when he gets the rest of your property. There can be no valid excuse or compromise on principle. It is necessarily a destruction of the principle, a violation of the principle. You see, bad principles cannot be consistently acted on. As I say, the consistent altruist kills himself. He must be unprincipled in action. He cannot be consistent. He cannot treat his principle as an absolute. In fact, you could say that about any religiously based or Kantian-based ethics. They simply cannot be lived up to. And if that's the case, that's going to burn you about principles as such. Now apply it to the objectivists who think we can skip the idea of philosophical education. Worse, objectivists who think that we can ally ourselves with enemies who have diametrically opposed ideas, like most of the Republicans today. No, you simply can't. In fact, you'd be cutting off your nose to spite, or use Peikoff's great analogy. You'd be uh, uh, purchasing your admission to the art museum at the price of ripping out your eyes. No, if we were to corrupt ourselves by compromising for political purposes right now, what we would end up with is a diluted form of anti-objectivism. No, I would much rather have a group of a small group of objectivists who truly understood it than a mass movement of people who claim to be objectivists and who are compromising and undermining it all the time. Any compromise on principle must be destructive of our ends and must always be. As Ayn Rand says, in any compromise between food and poison, it is death that can only win. Poison's going to have the advantage. You've conceded the principle of nutrition to the poison people. And once you've done that, it's a slippery slope. And that is why Republicans, every time, wishy-washy in their Christian ethics, they have no response to the socialists. Because they have no principled response to the socialists. They concede and compromise. Well, this one, this program, yeah, this one here, okay. When, of course, when they started doing that is when they lost the entire program. From that point on, it should have been easily predictable that Republicans, just as much as Democrats, will increase government and regulations and socialism at the end of their administrations, which is exactly what's happened. The only way to really turn that around is to turn around ethics. And the only way to turn around ethics is to understand epistemology and the role of principles. Can you address the pragmatic criticism found even among some objective? Oh, we've already done that. Joe Marone, can you address the pragmatic criticism found among some objectivists that we can't wait for? God, I just did that. Maybe there were the two questions really with the same answer. Joe continued. I mean, when that's referring to making compromises on principle as opposed to just relying on ad hoc issues. Yes, Rand made that distinction herself very clearly. We could ally ourselves with Democrats on the right issue. And once upon a time, there were Democrats with whom we could have allied on certain issues. You know, back in the 60s, the Democrats were far better, in the 70s, far better advocates of free speech than the Republicans were. And again, let's go back to ancient history. Back in the old days, at least Republicans mouthed a support for free trade and anti-tariffs and stuff. Donald Trump has, chucked that all together, obviously, and changed the Republican Party about at least the principles of free speech that it used to mouth nominally. So there would be nothing wrong with an ad hoc, case-by-case, issue-by-issue alliance with people who are even our enemies. That's not a problem, so long as it's narrowly focused on the issue that we're talking about here. But I am not going to give a blanket endorsement of either a Republican or a Democrat who is unprincipled or espouses principles that are opposed to objectivism in a fundamental way. No. Again, to do that would be to concede the entire case and to make our situation worse, not better. What are your thoughts on the possibility of a pro-freedom revolution in China? Not very high at the moment. Not very high at the moment. It was thought in some quarters when we started making friends with China, even back when Mao was in charge of things. Even the architect of the Cultural Revolution, Richard Nixon, opened up with, now back in those days, we were trying to drive a wedge between China and Russia. I don't see the advantage of having a totalitarian dictatorship as bad as Russia more on your side than otherwise. But that was, in effect, the situation that we were faced then with. No question about it. But China was thought that perhaps by having free trade with them, that we could open up them and liberalize them internally. That has turned out not to be the case. I think what we've ended up doing is with frankly, our lax attitude on intellectual property, the way in which we encourage trade with China, we have done something, I think, terribly wrong and made them economically stronger without, in fact, changing the fundamentally totalitarian, and it is still fundamentally totalitarian in its approach. Given the kind of censorship there, I disagree with certain objectivists even. I am not sanguine about the future of China because I don't see how a cultural change could really happen in China. So no, I think we have to treat China as the expansionist now totalitarian threat that they are.
From Ryan, what are your thoughts? That's the same one. Let's see. This reminds me of the problem of universals. Can you discuss that problem in this context?
Yeah. Leonard Peikoff got a question at the end of the speech that asked him to solve the problem of induction, and he gave a very brief answer and indicated that the fuller and actually the complete validation would be at least a lecture, if not several more lectures, and an entire volume of books. But principles do presuppose that our generalizations are valid. Ayn Rand solved the problem of the relationship between universals and particulars in her monumental, revolutionary work, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, by identifying the factual relationship between percepts and the concepts which they unify as a conceptual common denominator, a commensurable quality that they share with the measurements omitted, and that was the basis for organizing all of the concepts under all of these concretes under the same concept without losing all of their content. Happens because we can omit the measurements of the commensurable quality. That was the revolution. And Peikoff couldn't get into that in this lecture, but that was the revolution that solved the problem of universals and in effect solved the ultimate question of the problem of induction. Induction is not just the validity of a concept. A proposition relates more than one concept to one another. And so a generalization, a principled generalization like force equals mass times acceleration, or rationality, let me find a good one, be independent, have your focus primarily on reality as opposed to other people. That's a principle, and it's a universal principle. Any variation in that principle will get you into trouble in courts, disaster, and death. Just as ignoring the law of gravity when you're on a cliff, the edge of a cliff, or on the roof of a skyscraper would get you into trouble. If principles are true, then they apply to reality and do integrate all of this material. So going back to the one Peikoff used, all men are mortal. How do we know that all men are mortal? Is it simply a question of adding up the number of men that we've seen die? And gee, boy, it looks like a lot of people die, but how do we know everyone's going to die? How can we get to this proposition, all men are mortal? And often the contrast will be, since we've seen a million swans and they're all white, can we then say that all swans are white? Well, the fundamental difference between the two is one of stepping outside of the context of just swans or just dying humans. When we step out of that and try and integrate the rest of our knowledge, and that's what this really requires, is a comprehensive integration of our knowledge. Induction requires a comprehensive integration of our knowledge, and the kind of integration that only a conceptual faculty is capable of doing. But what we are capable of doing is looking at not just humans, but other animals. They all die. More than that, it's not just death, it's aging. People are born, they mature, they start decaying, they start aging. In fact, when you get to my age and you get to realize how we're decaying, there really can only be one inevitable outcome here. And all human beings do this, and this is the nature of life. And when you get down to it and you realize even more fundamentally there are genetic triggers that cause this, and that it's part of evolution, then you've identified the cause. And when you've done that, then you have a solidly valid inductive inference, all men are mortal. On the other hand, all swans are white. Well, just color variation in birds I mean, there's parrots, there's all kind canaries that are yellow, right? Cardinals that are red. Just between birds and within bird species, color and variation. Forget other animals. Forget dogs and fish and all the other various. Forget humans that come in various colors. The idea all swans are white is suspicious on the face of it. Once we step out and look at our other knowledge. Similarly, all men are mortal can only be validated by stepping out and looking at all of our other knowledge. It is when we integrate all of our knowledge, and only when we do so, that we can come up with a valid induction. And the capper is when, as I say, when we find a cause. That is the completion of a valid inductive process. I hope that answered your question. If businessmen had no choice but to compromise because of regulations, where does that leave them? It leaves them in an impossible situation. If they have valid principles that they're being asked to violate, then they're being asked to violate an absolute. They're being asked to violate their understanding of the facts of reality which are absolutes. That is what force does by its nature. Force and mind are opposites. So one could say, in more generally, force and acting on principle are opposites. The minute someone points a gun at you and says, do this, and make you do this against your will, they've negated your entire rational faculty. They've made your judgment, your principles, your concepts, your thinking, your integration of data is now irrelevant. The only person whose judgment matters is the guy holding the gun. And by holding a gun, he's told us he's not principled either, ultimately. But the point is that your judgment as the poor businessman has been completely invalidated. They are forcing you to act in an unrealistic way, a way that goes against the facts as you know them, against your best judgment of things. They're asking you to act suicidally. So, if you happen to disagree with the government regulation and you're a businessman, you're screwed. That's all there is to it. They're forcing you to act in an unprincipled fashion. That's the way I'd put it. The ultimate truth here is that principles cannot be avoided. Principles cannot be avoided. That is to say, you are acting ultimately. I mean, as Peikoff points out here, what these pragmatists are asking us to do is to be unprincipled in a principled way. Even the pragmatist cannot avoid acting on principle. Just as the rotten metaphysician who insists there are no absolutes will typically pound his fist, there are no absolutes. Or the person who says, knowledge is impossible, forgetting that he's asserted a claim of knowledge. This is absolutely the situation that we find ourselves in. So an altruist will say, oh, I believe in the principle of altruism. It's just that I can't be consistent with it. I understand I can't be, forgive me that I'm not consistent with it. I know I'm rotten for not, I have all the guilt that's induced from not being able to truly live up to my principle, but I cannot live up to my principle. But even the altruist has a principle of sorts that he's attempting to live up to. Human beings must process things conceptually. Human beings can only act on principles, wrong or right, even when those principles seem to be in conflict. And that's the thing. If you don't think through your principles, if they're not fact-based, if they're not integrated into a consistent whole, which only philosophy can do, then necessarily your principles are going to be like that. You're going to have to act with reference to abstractions and generalizations, right? But be unable to. And that's what's going to burn you about principles and lead you to the idea that since these principles can't be lived up to, particularly religious, religion is really the enemy here, right? Religion has inculcated in people the idea that moral principles cannot really be lived up to. Human beings are imperfect. They shouldn't expect to be able to do that. Well, that's not reality-based. Facts are absolutes. If you've integrated facts and only facts without reference to supernatural nonsense, then what you're doing is you're acting against the facts of reality. It is religion that has got people to think of principles as aimed at some otherworldly end, and something that we can't really live up to consistently anyway. So we have to be unprincipled. And so we have to be, let's put it this way, in reality, quasi-principled or pseudo-principled. We have to have the form of a principle that we're perfectly happy to violate whenever it seems necessary.
Hey, from Alejandro. Yes. Hi, James. If principles mean the mean the beginning, would rejecting principles imply rejecting metaphysics?
Okay, that will be the last question. And yes, rejecting principles does reject metaphysics. Metaphysics is the broadest form of principles that we have. As Peikoff uses in this very speech, existence exists. What is a tour of all that exists. A tour of all that exists. More than that, to reject principles that are fact-based is to reject the primacy of existence. My wishing, from the time I'm a child, and what toddlers will do, they'll cover their eyes in the hopes that something unpleasant in the world will go away. Oh, it's not there, I'll close my eyes. And then they open their eyes again and they realize that the world hasn't gone away. The minute a toddler realizes that the world just doesn't vanish because he closes his eyes, he realizes that reality has primacy over his consciousness, that his consciousness could mislead him, and it's up to his consciousness to conform to reality, not the other way around. That he has to pay attention to reality if he's to understand it, not evade it. So, from the time we're toddlers, we understand the primacy of existence, the absolutism of facts, the absolutism of reality. When a person who is unprincipled is telling you can't be principled, what they're in effect doing is rejecting the absolutism of facts, rejecting the absolutism of reality, rejecting the primacy of existence. Excellent question. That's in fact what it's rooted in. That's what the pragmatists will philosophically root their anti-principled argumentation in. We can't know reality. So here the real villain, the worst villain, is not Hume, who did undermine our notion of causality, and in the realm of ethics particularly undermine our capacity to come up with principles by the is-ought thing. The real worst enemy is Kant. Kant said that concepts don't really relate to reality. They're not about things in themselves. They're really just about our own, the filters and forms of our own perception. So the real enemy here is Kant and the assault on reason. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion, and if you enjoy these discussions, please feel free to subscribe to UK Center Ayn Rand. There are all kinds of perks, as I indicated, on the weekends. We'll now move our Peikoff seminar. I'm sorry I got that wrong in the beginning. We're going to move our Peikoff seminars to Sundays. We're still going to do Communication Boot Camp with Don Watkins. We're still going to do Ayn Rand essays on Tuesdays. We're still going to be doing the Daily Objective. There's all kinds of other perks that you get by subscribing. So hit subscribe, like, share these if you like this, and consider becoming a member of Ayn Rand Center UK. Thank you very much.